Imagine for a moment that the year is 1898 and the Nile runs glassy and indifferent past a dusty plain outside Omdurman. For nearly 2 decades, a theocratic empire had risen from the deserts of the Sudan, swarming victorious across battlefields where empires had once strutted. Its warriors charged with a faith so fierce that European columns dissolved at the sight of their banners. But in a single morning, on ground so open it might as well have been an execution yard, everything changed forever. A battle that lasted mere hours shattered a state, rewrote the map of Northeast Africa, and announced to the world that a new kind of killing had arrived. It was not a secret of steel or sorcery, but a weapon so simple to fire and so relentless in its appetite that it could turn courage into casualty in the space of a heartbeat. This is the story of Omdurman, where the Maxim gun and the idea behind it destroyed the Sudanese Mahdist empire in a blaze of mechanized fire. If you clicked for the secret weapon, here it is. Not just the machine gun itself, but an entire system built around it. Railways that fed it, gunboats that guarded it, telegraphs that guided it, and a commander who treated battle like engineering. To feel the magnitude of what happened that morning, we have to see where the Mahdists came from and why so many men believed they could outrun bullets with faith. In 1881, a mystic from Dongola declared himself the Mahdi, the Guided One, and called Sudanese tribes to throw off foreign rule. In a storm of victories, his black banners swept into Khartoum in 1885, and the British Empire reeled. The Mahdi died soon after, but his successor, the Khalifa Abdullahi, built a state out of sand and fire, taxing, drilling, and summoning tens of thousands to the call. For years, the Sudan was a closed world, guarded by river cataracts and desert distances, a place where horses, lances, and drums still decided the fate of cities. But the world was changing. When the British returned, they did not come as they had before. Major General Herbert Kitchener was not a romantic. He was a surveyor with a soldier's mustache, a builder of straight lines in crooked deserts. He pushed a railway from the Mediterranean down through Egypt toward the heart of the Sudan, every mile of track a vein feeding coal, biscuits, ammunition, and, above all, belts of gleaming brass cartridges. On the Nile, ironclad gunboats, low and ugly as toads, chuffed upriver, carrying quick-firing guns and a strange new confidence. In their wake came an Anglo-Egyptian army drilled to the second. Their companies formed like pages in a notebook, their Maxim guns bolted to tripods like industrial altars. The Khalifa could count men by the tens of thousands. Kitchener counted rounds. The Mahdist plan was as ancient as courage. Find the enemy and break him with speed, numbers, and the unanswerable force of faith. Kitchener's plan was as modern as smoke. Let the enemy spend himself against geometry and steel, then move. Omdurman was not just a battle. It was a collision between intention and invention, between the song of the drum and the stutter of a bridge block. And as the sun lifted over the desert on September 2, the Anglo-Egyptian line lay waiting behind zareba fences of thorn and wire, the barrels already cool, the belts already fed. The outcome would shape a continent. Virality tweak. Consider tightening the reveal of the Maxim gun by naming it in the very first sentence to punch the confirmation of the title even harder. Also, compress the railway description into one vivid sentence to keep pacing snappy during the hook-to-body transition. Dawn came with a shimmer. On the low rise of Sorghum, Kitchener's line unrolled in well-practiced order. British infantry in scarlet and khaki blocks, Egyptian and Sudanese battalions in steady ranks, cavalry posted where the ground allowed, batteries of quick-firing 12-pounders aligned like teeth. The Maxim teams checked feed blocks, oiled bolts, and sighted over a plain wide as a football field times 1,000. Beyond, the Kerreri hills crouched, and behind them, the army of the Khalifa gathered in heaving waves of color. green banners edged with gold, spearheads glittering, drums thudding like an approaching storm. There were tribal contingents whose names tasted of sand and iron, men who had chased British squares into the river at Abu Klea and watched Gordon fall at Khartoum. They had stories to answer bullets. They believed the old answers would work again. Kitchener did not advance to meet them. That was the trap he refused. He built a killing ground and made the enemy step into it. A zareba of thorn and wire fronted his position, anchoring a long, slight crescent. Behind it, the Maxim sat in banks, their crews resting elbows on ammunition boxes, each box a small promise of permanence. Farther back, the gunboats squatted on the Nile, their decks already hot, their sponson guns angled inland to rake any mass that wandered too close to the water's edge. In the air, observation balloons tugged at their tethers, a quiet new god watching men arrange themselves for death. Then the banners dipped, the drums quickened, and the plane moved. The first Mahdist rush came on in a roar, a wall of white jibbas and spearheads rolling toward the thorn fence. It looked like a tide, but it was not water. It was muscle, lungs, conviction. The Maxim teams waited until the officers' canes chopped down and the first belts rattled forward. What happened next is hard to imagine in the age of drones because it was so terribly close and so terribly mechanical. The guns did not speak, they sawed. Barrels licked with heat. Links clinked through gloved hands. The gun lines hosed fire in measured arcs, stitching the desert with invisible thread. Men fell, and the tide stumbled, and still it came. Artillery added its heavy punctuation. Shells blew ragged mouths in the charging clusters, lifting sand and bodies in the same grunting burst. Companies behind the guns fired by volley, the old discipline mixing with the new physics. Yet the courage in front did not vanish. The Khalifa's warriors tried to creep, to find low folds in the ground, to cut thorn with their blades and hands. Some crawled close enough to see the whites of the machine gunner's eyes before belts ran on, fresh as river water, and the saw started up again. In places, the line flexed, like canvas in a wind, but did not tear. This was the secret weapon laid bare, not a single contraption, but the union of devices with doctrine. The Maxims were the edge, but logistics was the hand that held the knife, and discipline was the wrist that kept it steady. Where previous armies had answered a charge with muscle, Kitchener answered with math. Range tables, overlapping fields, timed fuses, the choreography of reload and rest. Every second, the enemy remained in the open, multiplied the cost for them, and subtracted the risk for him. The plane that had once favored the swift now favored the systematic. By mid-morning, the first great wave was shredded. The banners slumped, and the survivors drifted back toward the hills, stunned that belief could bleed. Kitchener, still patient, refused the intoxicating chase. He straightened his line, checked his ammunition tallies, and sent messengers to the cavalry with orders still rolled tight. The day had another act, and he meant to choose where it would be performed. Kitchener's scouts brought in sketches traced in dust and memory. The shattered masses were not the end. On his right, in the shadowed folds of the Kerreri Hills, Osman Azraq had held back a strong wing, men who had watched the first assaults fail and believed they could find a seam on the Anglo-Egyptian flank. They began to spill from the hills like poured grain, angling to rake the line where the Egyptian and Sudanese battalions anchored the position. It could have been disaster. In earlier wars, that kind of oblique rush had turned squares inside out. But the new arithmetic held. Batteries pivoted on their axles, trails gouging the earth. The gunboats heaved closer to shore, their crews sweating at the training wheels, and the Maxim detachments on the right simply changed their aim. The same hard music started again, and the flank attack dissolved into smoke and echo. Not cleanly, not neatly, but decisively. Where the ground allowed, Egyptian companies stepped forward by bounds, their officers measuring distance with a glance and a habit, while Sudanese soldiers who had once fought under the Mahdi now held their rifles steady, and fired into old friends to preserve a new country. By late morning, the plain had become a ledger. Kitchener read it coldly. He had not come to win a single firefight. He had come to end a state. He ordered the army to wheel left in a great, slow arc toward Omdurman, the Khalifa's capital. The zariba was abandoned in place, the line reformed on the move, brigades dressing to guidons and dust clouds rather than parade markers. This was the second act, not waiting for the charge, but carrying the slow machinery of destruction forward to close the day on the enemy's heart. The gunboats slid along the Nile abreast of the infantry, trading signals with fluttering flags and the hiss of heliograph flashes. Their decks threw shell after shell inland, keeping the hills sullen and the riverbank clear of surprises. Ahead, a shallow gully cut the desert like a knife scratch, half hidden by scrub and heat haze. The 21st Lancers were sent to reconnoiter. They had not yet seen the thing for which cavalry would be remembered here. Their line lengthened at the trot, sabers tilted, dust rising to their knees. Then the gully erupted. Hundreds of Mahdist riflemen and spearmen boiled out of the corps at a handshake distance, men who had been lying flat in the sand, waiting. For one frozen breath, horse and human and steel hung together in the same terrible equation. Then the Lancers committed. They put spurs to ribs and cut through. Horses stumbled, men went under, riders swung and stabbed, carbines cracked at arm's length. Young officers who had imagined war in paintings discovered it lived in a brown ditch with a knife. They broke through, wheeled, and cut back again, leaving a trail of bodies and smashed tack. The charge did nothing to decide the battle, but it told a truth about courage in the new age. It could still glitter, but it could not govern. Among the troopers was a young war correspondent and subaltern named Winston Churchill, who would later write that the smell of cordite and the sight of the enemy's dead bodies of a machine gun at work had changed his notions of glory forever. The main body kept moving. The banners that had drifted back to the hills began to shake out again as the Khalifa tried to knit a new line between the ruins of the morning and the city behind him. He had numbers still, and he had will. He formed deep masses and sent them forward to halt Kitchener's wheel. The reply was a dance the Anglo-Egyptian brigades had rehearsed for months. Halt, dress, volley, advance, guns up, sights down, fire by section, lift the range, step off again. The Maxims did not tire. Their teams rotated, one man feeding, one firing, one cooling barrels and clearing stoppages with well-practiced hands. Ammunition wagons clattered forward, rails of belts lifted and carried like loaves from an oven. In the Nile, the gunboat's shells burst in the depth of the enemy formations, chopping lanes that infantry fire widened. Where brave men tried to close, they found the same thorn and lead, and their charges died not 10 paces from the muzzles. By early afternoon, the Khalifa understood. He gathered his bodyguard and a knot of banners and began to fall back toward Omdurman, hoping to salvage authority with presence, if not with victory. Kitchener sent the Sirdar's cavalry to harry the retreat while keeping his infantry tight. He would not be dragged into a street fight among dome tombs and tight alleys until the field was spent. The Anglo-Egyptian line crested the low rises and looked down on the city's mud domes and the great tomb of the Mahdi, a dark hive under the sun. Between them and those domes lay the wreckage of an army and the end of an idea. In the hours that followed, the pursuit became methodical. Columns angled to cut the route south, where the Khalifa might escape across open country. Some of his emirs fought on with magnificent futility, counterattacking to buy their leader a few more breaths of power. They died in knots around their flags, others threw their weapons down and drifted away, the awful truth finally heavier than duty. When Kitchener judged the field sufficiently decided, he ordered the forward brigades to halt and dress again. There would be an entry into Omdurman, but it would be on his terms, with guns supporting and flanks covered. He had promised efficiency, not theatrics. What had broken the Mahdist state on that plain was visible in every detail. The Maxim was the totem, yes, but the religion was logistics. Telegraph messages had threaded command decisions together faster than any messenger on a camel. The railway had delivered not just guns, but predictability, allowing Kitchener to plan a battle around certainty instead of hope. The gunboats turned a river from an obstacle into an ally. Intelligence from aerial balloons, sketch maps from scouts, and the disciplined drill of mixed brigades transformed a force of varied languages and uniforms into a single instrument. The Mahdists faced not a line of men, but a system that multiplied force wherever it was needed and refused battle where it was not. Faith and ferocity, which had toppled cities and squares a decade earlier, found themselves outnumbered by arithmetic. As the sun bent westward, the scale of the result became cruelly clear. Tens of thousands had hurled themselves against a precise machine and been broken. Casualty returns would later read like a misprint. The Khalifa's army torn apart by fire at ranges where men could see the pupils of the gunners who killed them, while the Anglo-Egyptian losses, though sharp in moments of shock like the Lancers' charge, remained astonishingly light for a field so broad. The numbers were not just statistics, they were proof that the balance between courage and killing had tilted. The British raised their campfires within sight of Omdurman's walls. The gunboats anchored in the slow brown curve of the Nile and let their boilers sigh. Somewhere beyond the city, the Khalifa's column moved like a wound toward the south, carrying the last embers of a theocratic empire that had once set the desert ablaze. In the days that followed, Kitchener would march into Omdurman, level the Mahdi's tomb in a gesture as much political as military, and declare the reconquest complete. Sudan would be folded into an Anglo-Egyptian condominium, a bureaucratic phrase that hid the hard truth of empire. The world would read that the machine gun had written its manifesto in the sand. The lessons spread along telegraph wires to capitals and barracks far away. Generals took note, rebels and patriots too. The secret weapon at Omdurman was not secret anymore. It was an advertisement for the next century. The aftermath of Omdurman was as quiet as it was grotesque. When the guns fell silent, the plain was carpeted with white jibbas, rifles, shields, and the still bodies of men who had carried faith against fire. British officers, hardened by campaigns from Egypt to India, found themselves walking among hills of corpses that steamed under the African sun. Horses picked their way through the wreckage, their hooves sinking into spent cartridges and torn cloth. The sand was littered with fragments of drums, sandals, and banners, whose verses were now unreadable beneath the soot. The smell was indescribable. Sweet and foul, the stench of history's turning point. Kitchener ordered a count. It took hours, then days to tally what the Maxim had done. Over 10,000 Mahdist warriors lay dead, another 13,000 wounded, and 5,000 captured. The Anglo-Egyptian losses amounted to fewer than 500. The ratio was so extreme it seemed to defy meaning. British correspondents, trained to find glory in proportion, struggled to describe what they saw. They used words like inevitable, scientific, terrible. One wrote that courage had been annihilated by chemistry. Even the soldiers who had fired the guns grew silent, their pride cooled by the sheer arithmetic of it all. It was victory, but it didn't feel like one. In Omdurman itself, the Khalifa's capital had already begun to unravel. The surviving emirs fled south or tried to surrender to Egyptian detachments that could barely keep pace with the collapse. In the heart of the city, beneath the towering dome of the Mahdi's tomb, the Khalifa gathered his household and bodyguard for what he knew would be his final stand. Kitchener entered methodically, the columns advancing street by street under banners now stiff with dust. There was no resistance worth the name. The tomb was stripped of relics, the Mahdi's body exhumed, his remains thrown into the Nile, a gesture meant to erase his legend. The city fell as easily as a camp after sunrise. What had begun as the conquest of a country ended as the conquest of a story. news of the victory raced through the empire in cable flashes and bold headlines. In London, crowds cheered Kitchener's name and newspapers spoke of vengeance for Gordon, avenged after 13 long years. The machinery of empire turned the massacre into mythology overnight. Paintings would show serried lines of British soldiers facing endless hordes, a struggle of civilization against barbarism. The reality, of course, had been something colder. Civilization had learned how to mass-produce death, and the desert had been its laboratory. Omdurman was not just the end of the Mahdist state, it was the birth of industrial warfare on a continental scale. The lessons extracted from the sand would echo across decades. Military academies pored over Kitchener's logistics, the synchronized advance of rail and river, the integration of machine guns with artillery, the coordination of signals and supply. It became a template for how to project mechanical power across distance. But beneath the precision was a warning few were ready to hear. The technology had finally outrun the morality of its makers. The Maxim gun was not a triumph of courage, but of convenience. It allowed small groups of well-supplied men to erase vast populations without ever seeing their eyes. It was, in every sense, the perfect imperial weapon. Across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, other powers took note. German, French, and Belgian officers studied the battle reports. They saw in Omdurman not a colonial anomaly, but a model for future dominance. Within a decade, machine guns would appear in every major army, their mechanisms refined, but their purpose unchanged. The same staccato rhythm that had shredded the Mahdist ranks would soon echo on the plains of South Africa, in the jungles of the Philippines, and, ultimately, across the trenches of Europe. The desert outside Omdurman had been a rehearsal for the 20th century. Yet for all its horror, Omdurman also marked the twilight of something older, the belief that courage alone could alter destiny. The Khalifa's men had marched with certainty that faith could protect them from lead. That belief had carried them through a generation of victories. In the end, it met a truth colder than any doctrine. The world had changed, and devotion could no longer deflect steel. The battle turned devotion into evidence, proof that modernity had no patience for miracles. The surviving Sudanese would live under the new order Kitchener built, a regime of administrators, surveyors, and soldiers. Roads and schools followed, but so did taxes, laws, and the quiet humiliation of rule from afar. In reports sent back to London, officials spoke of bringing civilization to the Nile. The people who had survived the Maxim scythe knew better. They had seen what civilization looked like when it came from a barrel. Omdurman's dead became unmarked dust, and its lesson was buried beneath imperial ceremony. For Kitchener, the triumph was both career and curse. He was promoted, knighted, and sent to new commands, his name forever bound to the desert he had turned into an abattoir. Yet the cold efficiency that had served him so well in war would later haunt him in politics. He had learned to treat men like elements of a formula, numbers, not souls, and the empire would discover that formulas cannot forgive. Still, at Omdurman, he had done what no one else could. He had made the empire feel invincible again, if only for a while. When later historians looked back, they saw in that battle the hinge between two worlds. Before Omdurman, war still contained traces of the personal. After it, the individual vanished into fire and smoke. The British rifleman who pulled a trigger did not defeat a man, he erased him. The Mahdist who charged with a spear was not fighting an enemy, he was colliding with the century to come, and in that collision, the old order shattered. The same efficiency that had conquered the Sudan would soon grind through Europe's fields, proving that the empire's secret weapon could not distinguish between foreign faith and familiar flesh. In the years that followed, the Sudan was pacified, charted, and folded into maps that no longer mentioned the Mahdi's dream. Railways reached farther south. Telegraph lines stitched the Nile like a scar. Children grew up learning the language of their conquerors, and the desert remembered in silence. But the ghosts of that morning stayed. They whispered in the wind over Sorghum Hill, where cartridge cases still surfaced after storms, and in the Nile's current, where the Mahdi's bones had drifted away. If the Battle of Omdurman has a lesson, it is not simply about weapons or empire. It is about blindness. The same civilization that marveled at its machine guns forgot that every innovation cuts both ways. The Maxim that made victory effortless also made slaughter impersonal. It stripped the act of killing of its last ritual and replaced it with a mechanism. That mechanism, once loosed into the world, could not be contained. It would cross oceans, multiply, and return home with vengeance. And yet, beneath the smoke and the metal, one truth remains. The Khalifa's men fought knowing they could not win. They charged anyway. There is a kind of dignity in that hopelessness, a human echo that even the Maxim could not silence. Their story, buried under imperial triumph, endures as a warning. No machine, no empire, no secret weapon can ever make conquest clean. If you've followed the story this far, take a moment to reflect on what it really means when technology outruns humanity. The Battle of Omdurman wasn't just history, it was prophecy. And if you want to explore more untold moments that changed the world forever, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Because history doesn't repeat itself, but it does reload. As the smoke of Omdurman settled into the pages of history, it did so not just as an event, but as a message, a grim telegram sent from the 19th century to the 20th. The empires read it carefully. They saw proof that courage could no longer contest machinery, that the moral weight of a cause mattered less than the industrial weight of its cartridges. The battle became a symbol of inevitability, and that illusion of inevitability would poison the next century. Kitchener's victory was reported as a triumph of discipline, order, and science. In truth, it was the birth cry of modern annihilation. In the months following the battle, engineers and officers returned to England carrying sketches of gun carriages, reports on rate of fire, and glowing evaluations of logistics. Manufacturers took note. The Maxim gun's success spawned imitators. The Vickers, the Hotchkiss, the Schwarzlows. Each model was lighter, faster, easier to feed. The logic of Omdurman spread like infection. If one gun could stop 10,000 men, then 10 guns could stop the world. The moral calculus that had once limited ambition evaporated. Colonies were subjugated with breathtaking speed, each campaign justified as progress. The machine gun became both cross and crown, the emblem of civilization and its executioner. The Sudan, meanwhile, began to absorb its conquerors. Administration replaced conquest. Surveyors mapped the land. Missionaries mapped the soul. The railway that had once carried shells now hauled cotton and grain. The Maxim guns mounted at stations as a reminder of how order had been achieved. The Khalifa, hunted after Omdurman, was finally killed in 1899 at Karat. His death closed the last chapter of the Mahdist dream. Yet even as his empire vanished, the ideals of resistance and faith that had animated it would resurface again and again, each time against new masters and new machines. History, it seemed, refused to obey mathematics forever. Kitchener's fame carried him to greater heights. He became the face of imperial efficiency, the Sirdar who could build a railway through the desert and crush a rebellion before breakfast. His portrait hung in clubs and mess halls. His methods were taught as the doctrine. But beneath the medals and ceremony, something essential had changed. The empire that celebrated him did not realize it was celebrating its own shadow. The same ruthlessness that had served Britain at Omdurman would soon be turned inward, into the trenches of the Western Front, where British boys would learn what the Khalifa's men had learned too late, that the machine gun is no one's ally. Winston Churchill, that young officer who had charged through the corps with the 21st Lancers, wrote later that Omdurman was the most unequal fight of modern times. He admired the discipline, even the spectacle, but confessed that it left him uneasy. The sight of men advancing into invisible fire had stripped heroism of its romance. His reflections hinted at a truth few dared to state, that progress without mercy is simply precision in cruelty. The Empire took pride in having avenged Gordon. It did not yet understand that it had also avenged the future against itself. Elsewhere, thinkers and strategists saw deeper implications. In Germany, General von Bernhardi cited Omdurman as proof that offensive spirit must now adapt to mechanized defense. In France, officers at the École de Guerre studied Kitchener's battle maps and began to design trench systems to resist such fire. None of them realized that in trying to prevent another Omdurman, they were building the framework for the Great War. The desert's arithmetic was coming home. The lessons learned among dunes and acacia would soon reappear among the poppies of Flanders. For the Sudanese survivors, however, Omdurman was not an academic case study. It was an open wound. Families searched the plain for missing fathers and sons. The Khalifa's bodyguard, once the elite of a holy army, was reduced to fragments. The British imposed taxes and conscription. They built schools that taught obedience in a foreign tongue. The memory of the Mahdi's revolt faded into folklore, retold in whispers around fires. But the humiliation endured. The idea that divine justice could confront material power would never die. It would merely change its name. In time, it would fuel new movements against new occupiers, each claiming the same inheritance of faith against the machine. By the early 1900s, the Battle of Omdurman had already become legend in military circles. It was dissected in lectures and textbooks, praised as an example of efficiency. Kitchener's precise coordination of infantry, artillery, and machine guns was described as the prototype for modern combined arms. Few questioned the cost of such precision. The official histories spoke of decisive action, superior training, splendid discipline. They did not mention the screams that had filled the air between the bursts of gunfire, or the sand that had turned to paste beneath the bodies. The world was stepping into the mechanical century with pride, not dread. Every industrial nation wanted its own version of the Maxim. Newspapers called it the weapon of peace, insisting that no army would dare attack another armed with such terrible instruments. They were half right. The weapon did keep peace until every side had it. Then, peace became impossible. By 1914, the logic of Omdurman reached its climax on the Western Front. The same steady fire that had swept the desert now swept no man's land, and the same calculus that had destroyed the Mahdist army now consumed millions of Europeans. The circle was complete. The secret weapon had come home. In retrospect, Omdurman was not an isolated triumph, but a rehearsal for catastrophe. The desert had been a proving ground for an idea that war could be managed, scheduled, perfected. Kitchener's railway had been a model for mobilization, his supply lines a prototype for total war. The Mahdist warriors had been the first to learn what happened when the human will met industrial precision. The soldiers of the Somme would be the second. Both would die in windrows before impersonal guns that never tired, never judged, never wept. And yet, hidden beneath this grim continuity, there remained a paradox. The same technology that made killing effortless also made its cost visible. Photographs from Omdurman, those stark black and white images of bodies scattered like driftwood, began to circulate in illustrated papers. For the first time, the public could see what imperial victory looked like unvarnished. Some readers thrilled, others recoiled. The seeds of doubt were sown. The empire could win, yes, but could it still call itself righteous? The question, whispered in salons and newspapers, would haunt Britain long after the guns cooled. As the century turned, the Sudan lay quiet, Ruled but restless, the Nile continued its ancient rhythm, indifferent to the blood spilled on its banks. Omdurman's plain slowly healed. Acacia trees grew where men had fallen, and the wind buried the spent cartridges beneath dunes. Travelers who visited years later said the ground still glittered faintly in the morning sun, as if the desert itself remembered. Kitchener would die at sea in 1916 when his ship struck a mine. A man swallowed by the same modern forces he had once mastered. The empire he served would survive him, but its moral certainty would not. The secret weapon that destroyed the Sudan did more than kill an army. It killed the illusion that war could ever again be noble. Omdurman's legacy was not victory, it was revelation. It revealed what happens when intellect serves only efficiency, when innovation forgets compassion, when progress believes itself divine. That revelation still lingers whenever technology promises safety through superiority. The hum of drones, the glow of screens, the distant thunder of modern weapons, all of it carries an echo from that desert morning in 1898, when humanity first mistook invention for inevitability. By the time the 20th century fully dawned, the echo of Omdurman had already settled into the bones of empire. Every officer educated at Sandhurst, Saint-Cyr, or Potsdam had read its reports, memorized its maps, and internalized its arithmetic. It was studied not as a tragedy, but as a formula, a demonstration that precision, logistics, and modern weapons could bend entire peoples to the will of a few. The idea was intoxicating. For a time, it made imperialism feel invincible, inevitable, almost moral. And yet, hidden beneath that polished narrative was something darker, the knowledge that power had outpaced wisdom, that men had built a machine they no longer fully controlled. Omdurman was more than a battle. It was the moment when human warfare crossed the threshold into industry. Before it, generals spoke of courage and maneuver. After it, they spoke of calibers and rates of fire. The transition was silent, mechanical, irreversible. Every factory that turned out another belt of ammunition, every line of telegraph wire humming across continents, was a descendant of that morning's efficiency. The desert where the Mahdist banners once shimmered had become the birthplace of a new creed, the belief that war could be perfected if only it were organized enough. It was a lie dressed in precision, and the world believed it. Back in the Sudan, the silence that followed was not peace. It was suppression disguised as order. The Anglo-Egyptian condominium ruled by decree, layering bureaucracy over the wounds of war. The old Mahdist strongholds were dismantled or repurposed, their names scrubbed from official maps. Kitchener's railway became a line of control more than of progress, carrying soldiers and administrators deeper into the continent. Schools were built to teach loyalty. Crops were regulated to feed markets far away. The people, who had once marched for faith, now labored under empire's arithmetic. Their weapons were gone, their gods humiliated, their sons conscripted. Only memory resisted, and memory is the one rebellion no empire has ever conquered. Across Europe, the intellectuals who celebrated Kitchener's triumph began to suspect that something vital had been lost. In cafes and lecture halls, poets and philosophers wondered aloud whether technology had liberated mankind or merely refined its brutality. Rudyard Kipling praised the empire's machine with hymns of duty, while others, like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, would later curse its perfection in blood-soaked verse. Omdurman had been their prologue, a rehearsal in the desert for the industrial apocalypse waiting in Europe's fields. When millions died beneath machine guns in Flanders and on the Marne, they died under a doctrine first proven beside the Nile. Kitchener never lived to see the full circle. When his ship struck a mine in 1916, the sea swallowed him and his myths alike. Yet the legend remained, a stern face, a pointing finger, and a slogan. Your country needs you. The same empire that had praised him for Omdurman now invoked his image to feed men into the very machines his victory had inspired. In that sense, He was present on every battlefield that followed, his legacy echoing in the pulse of the vicar's gun and the whistle of shells. The empire he had served learned too late that its secret weapon could not distinguish between subjects and sons. In Sudan, decades passed. The Mahdi's tomb was rebuilt, the Khalifa's name returned to songs. The British left at last, not defeated by arms, but eroded by time and fatigue. Independence came in 1956, wrapped in ceremony and contradiction. The new nation inherited borders drawn by strangers and memories too raw to heal. Yet within those memories lay the same paradox that had defined Omdurman itself, the clash between faith and progress, between spirit and machine. The descendants of those who fell on the plain carried both wounds and wisdom, that freedom bought through violence is fragile, but submission to machinery is death of the soul. Modern visitors who stand on the battlefield today see little of the old horror. The ground is calm, the river slow, the wind indifferent. Yet if you listen long enough, the silence carries a vibration, a whisper of drums, the clatter of bolts, the heartbeat of thousands who charged into eternity. The Maxim guns are gone, their metal rusted or displayed behind glass, but their rhythm lingers in every new device mankind builds to make killing effortless. Every drone strike, every missile launch, every sanitized screen of war footage is an echo of Omdurman's first mechanical hymn. Perhaps that is the true secret weapon. Not the gun itself, but the idea that control equals righteousness. Kitchener believed it. The Empire believed it. We still do in subtler ways. The belief that technology can solve what morality cannot has never left us. Omdurman was proof of its danger, and yet its lesson remains half-learned. Progress keeps marching, always certain, always armed, always surprised when the old ghosts rise again from the sand to remind us that victory and virtue are not the same. So when we look back on the Battle of Omdurman, we are not just studying history, we are confronting ourselves. The plain outside Khartoum is more than a battlefield. It's a mirror. It shows us what happens when human genius is used without restraint, when invention forgets compassion, when we trade wisdom for certainty. The secret weapon that destroyed the Sudan was not merely the Maxim gun. It was the arrogance that wielded it, the faith in machinery over mercy, the conviction that progress excuses everything, and that weapon is still with us. If you found this story as haunting as it is fascinating, take a moment to reflect and to share it. Like the video, subscribe for more untold chapters of history, and tell us in the comments what lessons you think Omdurman still holds for the modern world. Because the past isn't gone, it just reloads in new forms, waiting for someone brave enough to recognize it before the guns start again.